In this video, we'll look at the foreign policy of the United States during the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings can be seen not only in the growth of an integrated national economy and the growth of federal power and all that, but also in a more nationalistic foreign policy, not surprisingly. Immediately after the War of 1812, Madison requested and won a permanent standing army, and this of course required regular and extensive taxes to fund it. He also encouraged the Navy to remain large. I'd mentioned this in a previous video, but you got to understand this was a big change from the past. In the past, what the United States would do is just demobilize it in its military at the end of a war, and everybody would go back to the state militias, and they'd call up the state militia if there was new fighting. There was no permanent standing army, but now there is. And by the way, you can still see a vestige of this in the National Guard today, the idea of citizen soldiers. In this slide, you can see what the soldiers look like on the towards the right, the one highlighted here. President Monroe nominated John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State, and John Quincy Adams would become a leading figure in forming Monroe's nationalistic foreign policy. As we have already said, he was the son of the founding father John Adams, but kind of a sad figure personally. He lost 2 brothers and 2 sons to alcoholism. John Quincy Adams was important not only because did he guide Monroe's nationalistic foreign policy, but later on he became a president himself and continued his nationalistic policies. Here you can see Monroe's request of Congress. He's nominating John Quincy Adams to Secretary of State and notifying Congress of that nomination. I have already mentioned the Tariff of 1816 and the growth of the federal government, but this is also part of foreign policy. The sense of nationalism got this passed. And you would think that the South would resist this because they would fear retaliatory tariffs on their cotton exports and whatnot. And there was some of that. You can see in this cartoon here protesting it by using an old Revolutionary War emblem and suggesting the higher tariff would end or cook the Union. But, it passed, and because the South saw the growth of the textile industry, their emergent factories and outwork system in the North, as a potential market for its cotton, and no reason they had to export to Britain. And so John C. Calhoun and other South Carolinians and whatnot, they didn't resist the Tariff of 1816 because they thought that they have a new market, the North. Adding to the apparent contentment after the war was a growing rapprochement with Britain. Both sides wanted to get the ugliness of the War of 1812 behind them and wanted to get on with trading. Avoiding one potential source of irritation, Acting Secretary of State Richard Rush met British Minister Charles Bagot, and they signed what became known as the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, which helped eliminate naval competition on the Great Lakes. Both countries agreed to limit their forces to only several revenue ships. Although the treaty itself made no mention of the land disputes between British Canada and the U.S. that still existed, it did give rise to the tradition of an unfortified border, the longest in the world and one that still exists today. 2 very important international agreements were the Convention of 1818 and the Adam-Monish Treaty. The Convention of 1818 settled that land dispute between British Canada and the United States. The Convention of 1818 sort of extended the national boundary westward along the 49th parallel, and the agreement was to go from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. Now, west of the Rocky Mountains in what was called Oregon Territory, the British still claimed that, and the Americans claimed it as well, but they sort of agreed to jointly occupy it and sort of deal with it later on. The only remaining irritant at the time after the Convention of 1818 with Britain was the British efforts to restrict American ships from its lucrative West Indies trade. Monroe responded by basically saying the U.S. wouldn't trade with any British colony closed to U.S. ships, and And trade with British West Indies remained a problem throughout much of the 1800s. The other significant treaty was the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, a year later. And this was with Spain, not Britain. Spain agreed to give up all of Florida in return for the U.S. assuming and paying $5 million that private U.S. citizens owed Spain. Both sides also agreed to a compromise border between New Spain, the southwestern part of what's now the United States, and the recently purchased Louisiana. The U.S. gave up any claims, I should note, that it had earlier started to say it wanted along the coast in Texas. And it set the border between Spanish territories and Louisiana along the Red River to the Arkansas River, then westward along the Arkansas River up until the 42nd parallel, which then extended to the Pacific. It's sort of like a stepping stone if you look at it on the map. Below it would be Spanish territory, and above it would be the American Louisiana territory. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 didn't just come out of the blue with Spain. There was some background. Now you got to remember, Florida had originally been Spanish, but Britain had gotten it with the Treaty of Paris ending the French and Indian War. Well, Spain had gotten it back with the Treaty of Paris ending the American Revolution. And you may recall as well that Pinckney's treaty had settled the border between the United States and Florida there. But nationalism, during the during the era of good feelings, helped stir up passions in America to take Florida over itself. And, Spain was a declining power. It was suffering both internal and colonial revolts. And Spain had gotten so weak that it really couldn't control the Indians in Florida, who would continue to attack the U.S. in spite of their Spanish promises to stop it in Pinckney's treaty. And so this led to conflicts. In 1817, Americans had burned a Seminole border settlement, killing 5 of its inhabitants, and dispersed the rest across the border into Florida. At this point, the Secretary of War Calhoun authorized a campaign against the Seminoles and summoned General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812 Battle of New Orleans, from his home in Nashville to take command. And Jackson's orders allowed him to pursue these Indian offenders into Spanish territory, but officially he wasn't supposed to attack the Spanish. Now, Jackson wanted all of Florida and boldly remarked that if the U.S. wanted him to take all of Florida, he could do it in less than 60 days. He said all he needed was the authority to attack, and suggested that this might be sent through a Tennessee congressman named John Maria. Well, soon afterwards, Jackson did indeed get a letter from Maria and claimed it was the authority he needed from Monroe. The Monroe always denied it, but today the Rhea letter shown here remains sort of a mystery. In any event, whether Monroe had sanctioned it secretly or not, Jackson attacked the Florida Panhandle. He had help from his Tennessee volunteers and was brutal to the Seminoles, hanging 2 of the leaders without any semblance of a trial. He drove the Spanish out of Pensacola and then returned to Nashville. The whole episode had taken less than 4 months, and the U.S. was in essence in complete control of the Florida Panhandle. Yeah, Spain was outraged, and officially Monroe was as well, because Monroe was still saying that he had not authorized the attack, but privately everybody thinks Monroe was pretty pleased. And it was pretty obvious that the United States could steal Spanish Florida whenever they wanted to. And so it's not surprisingly that the Spanish eventually agreed to the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819. Probably the best example of a nationalistic foreign policy was the famous Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, French troops had helped put down a rebellion against the Spanish monarchy. And Britain was worried because they didn't want Spain and France getting together and allying against her. And rumors were beginning to fly as well that, France was going to help the Spanish reestablish her lost American empire. Spain had just signed the Adams-Onis Treaty and had basically been forced out of Florida. And I should note that Mexico had just won its independence from Spain not long before. And so the British Foreign Minister, George Canning, approached Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and suggested that the two nations agree to resist together any such attempt by France or Spain. And this really prompted a debate in the Monroe administration. Monroe sought out the sage Jefferson at Monticello, and this was only a couple years before Jefferson died. And Jefferson said maybe you should take the offer. Of course, John Quincy Adams had different ideas because he said there was no need for the British. He said, and I quote, "It would be more candid as well as more dignified to avow our principles explicitly to Russia and France than to come as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war," unquote. He said we ought to just tell people to stay out on our own. Why do we need the British? Also, the British had just added a stipulation which kind of annoyed John Quincy Adams. He wanted the U.S. to agree not to acquire any more Spanish territory, including Cuba, Texas, or California. And, Americans had their eyes on that in the future. So what Monroe ended up doing was he rejected the advice of Jefferson and agreed with John Quincy Adams. And he outlined his position in his annual message to Congress in 1823, shown here and become famous as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically comprised 4 points. First, it said, quote, "The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power," unquote. Second, the political system of European powers was different than that of the United States, which would, quote, "consider any attempt on their part to extend their systems to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety," unquote. Third, the U.S. would not interfere with existing European countries. And fourth and final, the U.S. would keep out of all internal affairs of European nations and their wars. So, we're basically saying, hey, you Europeans stay out of the Western Hemisphere, North, Central, and South America, and we Americans will stay out of yours. When Monroe made his statement, it really didn't draw much attention here or in Europe. It was kind of, America wasn't much of a power, and it wasn't much of a threat to them, to the extent that they noticed the Europeans kind of just laughed at it, thought it was rather presumptuous. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even called the Monroe Doctrine until 1852. It really didn't mean much since, the doctrine had no existing standing in international law, and its effectiveness really was dependent upon the British Navy, which could, break it at will. Anyway, this policy is going to become historic and throughout the 19th century American foreign policy. This concludes the video on American foreign policy in the era of good feelings.